This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior officers from the U.S. intelligence community. And today I have a real trendsetter. Her name is Rollie Flynn. She is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute based in Philadelphia. It's a highly regarded nonprofit. She is a 30-year veteran from the CIA, held a number of senior executive positions at headquarters, and was chief of several major stations overseas in Southeast Asia and Latin America. She's had a number of teaching positions. She's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She has a bachelor's degree from Wellesley and a master's degree in cybersecurity from UMUC. Rollie, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thanks very much, Jim. Appreciate being invited.
Rollie, how did you get started with CIA?
Well, I have to admit it wasn't part of a grand plan. I was an English major at Wellesley, and I always had wanderlust. I'm probably the only person in history who, as an act of rebellion, and I'm Northern Californian, went to Wellesley rather than Berkeley because I thought that was seeing the world. And so, and I'd never been east of Reno at that point. So I've always had a bit of wanderlust. But after Wellesley, English major, I ended up in book publishing. So I spent about 5 years in New York, just shy of that, at Doubleday and Simon & Schuster, and ended up as an editor. And that was when I saw an ad in the New York Times on the op-ed page back where Mobil Oil and Exxon used to advertise, big corner advertising space. And there was an ad from the CIA, and it said, "Do you like adventure? Would you like to serve your country? And would you like to see the world?" And I just thought, well, yeah, that all sounds really great. So I sent a cover letter and a resume as instructed to this name and P.O. box in Washington. And of course, later learned that the name was no such person. So, I had my first interview in New York and New York City in a hotel room, of course. And the gentleman who interviewed me, Before I came to the interview, they asked us to get and read, if possible, The Craft of Intelligence by Alan Dulles. So I searched all the libraries and the bookstores, of course, and this was pre-Amazon, so there was no getting that book, except that I worked in book publishing. So I called a bookseller up in Connecticut, and I called many booksellers, but found one in Connecticut that was able to send me that book for about. It was expensive. It was like $27, which in 1981 or 80, I can't remember. I guess it must have been 81. Was expensive, but I got it. I read it, and years later, I had the occasion to read my personnel file, and right in the front was this interview of the write-up of the interview, and the person who wrote it said, in 2 days of interviews in New York, Rollie was the only one who managed to get the book and, miracle of miracles, had read it and could discuss it. And he said, "I think this bodes well for a career in the DO." So that was how I came. And my only real goal when I joined, because in those days there was no internet and there weren't that many books about it. And so my only real goal when I joined was to learn French. I wanted to serve somewhere where they spoke French, and I wanted to learn to speak French. And of course, I never served in a French-speaking post and never learned French. But and I sort of said, I was living in New York City. It was sort of a very liberal, anti-CIA kind of place. If you were, 26 years old, which was what I was. So I sort of said, I'll give this 5 years. And of course, once I got in, I realized, what a terrific place the CIA is and what terrific people. And, I was at Simon & Schuster, and in the book publishing industry, I worked with a lot of smart, really creative people. And when I got to the CIA and got to the DO, I realized I'm working here with a lot of really smart, really creative people. But I'm also working with really ethical people, the kind of people, if you're on a sinking boat, you'd want as your boat mates. And so CIA not only had a great mission, but it was just really interesting. And there was always that lure of the next assignment. If things were going bad, you could say, Well, it's really bad here, but I've got this possibility of this next job. So it kind of kept you going. So that's how I came to the CIA, totally on a lark, a total lark, and end up staying for just shy of 30 years. But anyway, so that's how I got there.
Rollie, you were an example of an early, very successful senior female overseas operations officer. What was that like when you joined, and how did it evolve over the years?
Well, it changed a lot. When I came in, there were only a handful of us. And I do remember in one of my early posts, my first post, in fact, I I was going to a source meeting and sort of doing a long walking, preamble to having that meeting to sort of clean myself off and see if I could spot some surveillance. And partway into my walk around this African city, and I had myself, wearing a scarf, so I wasn't quite so obviously, an American. And two young fellows on a motorbike started following me, but they were sort of laughing and saying, "Hey, you want to go to the movies with me? You want to get coffee with me?" I couldn't shake them. They could clearly tell I was a Westerner, and maybe there was a little blonde hair peeking out from my scarf. And so they followed me, all around. And I finally had to say, I can't go to this meeting. I can't bring these guys to my meeting. And so the next morning I had a sort of a gruff chief of station, and who I like a great deal and who is a friend, but he was sort of gruff. And when I went in his office to explain what had happened and how I had to go to the variant, or the next opportunity to meet my source, as I was walking out of the office, I heard him grumble, "Women case officers." So I don't think he was thrilled that he had a woman working for him, but he ultimately turned out to be a great boss. There were some drawbacks to having a woman, and that I stood out. There were also some advantages. I got meetings that the guys didn't get because I wasn't threatening. And, you can sit two women on a park bench or in a parked car, and they can sit there for hours doing surveillance and no one will think anything about it. You put two guys in a car or sitting for hours, it becomes suspicious. So I think there were some opportunities, and certainly I did see a change. By the time I left, women were in positions of executive positions, and there were more in the field than when I started. And I think there was a growing awareness that women can do this job too. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And I think that goes for diversity at the CIA too. It wasn't the world's most diverse place when I joined. And when I left, there was certainly an appreciation of the value of people who can blend in places around the world and can speak a variety of languages and play other nationalities if need be. And so I think the CIA became a much more diverse place. And certainly there was official recognition of the value of having a more diverse workforce. And there was a point about midway through my career, I think when I got to be about a GS 13 or 14, when this probably isn't a popular thing to say, but I think I was discriminated for because they would want to have, an example of a woman who'd actually recruited people overseas and had done that job. And so, I seemed to get put on some panels and like if they wanted a group of case officers to go up to talk to the DDO, I somehow got picked in that lot more than maybe I might have if I hadn't been female, because we still weren't that many of us. So, but certainly I saw a lot of change and an appreciation that women can do the job too. They might do it differently in some cases, just because, we are at the mercy of the security services that, follow us and monitor what we do, and some of the hostile intelligence services. But certainly I think there was an appreciation that women can do the job too.
Rollie, over your 30-year career, how did you see the mission change And what do you see as possibilities for the mission in the future?
Well, I certainly saw the mission change a lot. I mean, I started my career, my first two assignments were in Africa, and this was the 80s height of the Cold War. And the African continent certainly played an important role in the Cold War, where a lot of the African countries were sort of divided into who did they side with? The Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, or NATO and the United States of America? And as well as in terms of our DO activities, we used the real estate of places like countries in Africa, because it was a place where you could actually get relatively easy access to Soviets and to the Warsaw Pact diplomats and official personnel. And so it was sort of a hunting ground for us. In some of the places I served, there was only one grocery store, two grocery stores, and everybody had to shop there. So, you'd see your KGB counterpart in the cereal aisle. And in fact, I remember one sort of funny incident. And I remember we got this cable out, informing us that Check-a-Day was coming up. And Check-a-Day, if I recall correctly, I want to say is in December. I may have gotten that wrong. But, and I was in the Southern Hemisphere, so December wasn't what we think of as December. It was summer. But they told us that a lot of residenturas celebrate Check-a-Day, because that was the founding of the security services, foreign security services, and be on the lookout for opportunities for Check-a-Day. I'm not sure what that meant, but I was in the grocery store in this African capital, the one of two grocery stores, and who do I see but one of the KGB guys in there? And what's he carrying? He's only got one thing in his shopping cart, and it's a little toy gun. And I'm thinking, I bet he's taken that to his Check-a-Day celebration as some kind of a spoof gift. So we knew each other, and I said, well, hello. and I don't think he really wanted to see me at that point with his little toy gun in his. And I didn't mention Check-a-Day, but I just said, that's an interesting selection of groceries you're buying. So anyway, but in a huge European or Asian capital, it wouldn't necessarily be as easy to have casual encounters with, our Soviet and Bloc counterparts. And so it was sort of a lucrative hunting ground. And so that made Africa and some of the other places in the world, it was, as I say, the height of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, and we can say, did it ever really end? That question is certainly open right now. We went to the 90s, which was the peace dividend. The post-Cold War peace dividend, where some of our colleagues were even talking about, cozying up and treating the Russians like they were best buds at that point. But it had, of course, an impact on our budgets in the 90s. And CIA took some blows during that period. We had, of course, Aldrich Ames, and I was in the DDO's office in the year following as one of the special assistants. I think they now call them executive assistants. But, we were really getting beat up because of Ames. And some would say we should have, by the Hill, by the media. And our budgets got smaller. There was talk, and I think there's some downsizing of the agency. And as well as voices on the Hill, such as Patrick Moynihan, who twice introduced bills suggesting that the CIA be dismantled and its parts being divided up between other agencies, most prominently the State Department and the military. And so I think collectively it's my impression alone, but I think morale was low in the 90s. And, it was not the way I felt when I was in Africa in the 80s. And I also did one tour in Southeast Asia during the 80s. And we were all, we were very motivated, I think, by the Cold War. Of course, that all came to a crashing end after 9/11, when the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community did that pivot to counterterrorism. And I was in Latin America at the time, and we were very much focused on, of course, hard targets as always, but also on counter narcotics. And we sort of felt like stepchildren after 9/11 because that was clearly the priority. And some of the folks in the station where I was did get tapped to go to the war zones. I volunteered to go to, take me out, but I was chief of station. And so they took my deputy instead. For 6 months, I think he was deployed to one of the war zones. Some would say, we pivoted too far. We lost sight of our true mission. And I think certainly there was an impact on tradecraft, because there was, I think, probably at least a decade where almost all first tour officers had to do their first assignment in one of the war zones. And I don't want to betray any tradecraft secrets, but war zone tradecraft is not the same as what you practice if you're in a area where there is a sophisticated and potentially hostile or hostile intelligence service. So I think, my own impression, that had an impact on the, that workforce that came up during that period. And I think, obviously with us pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think we're all realizing that, writing off the Russians and their malign influence in the world, I think was short-sighted. Certainly in, the early 90s when we were all doing that. Not all, but many were doing that. In terms of looking at the future, I think some of the real game changers have already started, and technology is certainly a huge game changer, both in terms of our defense and our offense. And I think one of the most obvious offensive weapons we now have, or tools we now have, not weapons, I don't want to use weapons, tools we now have, which we can talk about publicly because everybody knows it, is big data. I remember back in the Cold War, I don't know if this is really true, but you heard stories where people looked at the, photographs of the Politburo and tried to discern who was in power and who wasn't by where they were standing. Or if there was a photo missing, what happened to that person? Where we went from a case where there was very little data to now there is so much data. And we've developed analytical tools, automated tools, and machine learning, artificial intelligence, so that we can manipulate that data to make analytical conclusions, which, when in conjunction with other sources of intelligence, SIGINT, HUMINT, can give us, information and analysis that we didn't used to have. So we've also seen, of course, the Russians use data as a covert action tool, active measures. We saw that during the 2016 election, where instead of just, hacking the Hillary campaign emails, they actually weaponized them and put them, through WikiLeaks out, leaked them selectively in that campaign. And I think, we saw in the run-up to the Ukrainian invasion, we saw the U.S. government using intelligence in a new way that we hadn't seen on as great a scale. The selective public release of intelligence information, which I think was pretty effective as I'm not an insider anymore, but just watching it as a lay observer, that I do think we eroded Putin's element of surprise. And a lot of that, that satellite imagery is out there in the public. So the media, and I know at FPRI, our scholars are just looking at open source satellite imagery. They are now, and they were in the run up to this. So they were able to see very clearly the deployment of military assets, the Russian military assets, both in advance and during. But I do think our selective release of intelligence on Russian troop deployments, on what appeared to be Russian deception operations, I think that preempted and maybe set Putin back on his heels a little bit. I have no intelligence I'm not privy to that anymore. But I think the technology has been a great game changer, and it has defensively as well. And there have been articles written on what it's done for, human operations. And I just think back to, we had officers travel on alias passports and pretend to be something they're not, sometimes different nationalities, false flag operations. Well, now every passport has a biometric. Most of the airports you go through, or many are doing iris scans, and, there's technology out there. Doing the kind of alias operations that we did in the past are much harder. You check into a hotel nowadays, they're scanning your passport with that biometric. They have databases, and they often, when you check in and you hand them your documents, they will say, "Oh, Ms. Flynn, are you still at such and such address in, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania?" Because they've all got it before you give it to them. And so if you're going to run operations, either you have to have an exceptional memory, if you're doing it in true name. It has complicated our clandestine operations. And again, I'm not privy to what they're doing now, but I trust there are a lot of clever people at the CIA, and they're figuring out a way around this, because my own view is human will always be relevant. You can get all that big data analysis, you can get SIGINT, you can get overhead imagery, but the human source can give you the context and tell you if this person you heard on SIGINT is lying, or what's the story behind the story. What's the motivation? And read the body language and know the individual. Human gives you something the other ends don't, I believe. And it's also cheap. It's the cheapest of all the ends. I mean, we're pennies on the dollar compared to building satellites and big computer systems. So I guess it's pretty obvious I'm a fan of human, having practiced it for 3 decades of my life. I think a big power rivalry is back. I think China is very important to watch, and particularly how China reacts to what Putin's doing, because obvious parallels have been drawn between China and Taiwan, and Russia and Ukraine. So again, I think CIA I don't think we were ever out of business, but we're back in business in a big way. And I do think there are some parallels to the 80s when I began.
Rollie, what was the hardest thing you ever had to do when you were a case officer?
Well, I had to do a lot of hard things. As I think about it, operationally, there's some real hard things. I remember when I was in Latin America, there was an active terrorist presence in the city and country where I was living and working. And we were, of course, always looking for sources within that terrorist organization. And we had one. And he was a relatively new member of this terrorist organization. And this was an organization that, as part of their bona fides, you had to go shoot a police officer. And so our young source came to our case officer and said, they're asking me I have to go shoot a police officer. Well, those are very hard situations, because you want to be able to prove the bona fides of your source. And I can't, there are various ways you could probably try to solve that. Either you break his gun, so it doesn't fire, or you aim high, or, he gets sick on the day, deathly ill with something really bad like malaria where he can't get out of bed. And as it turned out, the appointed hour came and the person he was supposed to shoot didn't show up. So it was, fortunately, but those kind of really, really hard dilemmas, I thought were really hard. But to be perfectly candid, the really, really hardest thing I had to do was I was in a country as chief of station where the country was falling apart, and all the Americans, all the official Americans, all but a handful of us were being evacuated. And my kids were little at the time. My son was in kindergarten and my daughter was in second grade. And they had to be evacuated. But because I was chief of station, had to stay. And so fortunately, one of our neighbors was a Foreign Service officer, and my daughter played with her little girls. And she just came to me and she said, I'll take your kids for you, and I'll take them to your relatives if you want. And they were out. We knew they would be gone for a minimum of a month, because that's when State Department evacuates, they all go out for a month. So I'll never forget the drive to the airport where we were going out. We were going in convoy. And of course, as part of our mission, we were, of course, very active reporting not only intelligence, but also doing our best to give, street by street assessments of what was happening so that this American convoy could make it to the airport. So I was in the car with, I think we were two families crammed into one vehicle. And I was taking my two children to the airport, and my son was on my lap. And as we drove, one of the major shopping centers that would normally have been totally lit up because I think it was a Friday night, and it was just totally, it would have been totally lit up. It was totally in the dark. I mean, there was almost no one on the street. And as we were passing it, my son in my lap looks out the window and he says to me, "Oh, Mom, cool, look, a tank." And I'm like thinking, oh my God, what have I done to my children to put them in this environment, potentially in harm's way? And there were a couple other incidents when I had fear for my children, and which I won't go into. But, those are really the hardest things, when you have to say, golly, what have I done? And so that was very hard.
Yeah, those family separations are really tough. And sadly, far too many of our colleagues have had to experience that over the years, particularly in more recent times.
Yeah, including, or potentially putting your family in harm's way.
Rollie, as you know, both FPRI and AFIO have great relationships with academia, and we have student audiences. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to address, especially to students today?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. One of the most satisfying things I do is a lot of students contact me, both from Georgetown, or some I meet, or they come to me through FPRI, expressing interest in working in intelligence. And so I love talking to young folks, because I think the future of our country depends on this next generation, good folks going into government, and the intelligence community is part of that. And so the first thing I say is keep your nose clean. Don't get arrested. Think before you do stuff. And marijuana is still a federal crime. So if you're applying to the CIA or the intelligence community, don't do it. Or any federal job, don't do marijuana. Don't do drugs. But the other thing I would say is, of course, there are so many people who apply to the CIA, and I don't know, it used to be 150,000 a year, it may be more, but it's a lot. And so, there's a certain percentage of those who are wackos and who are absolutely unqualified. But there are a lot who are qualified. And so I think it's really important to distinguish that not only are you qualified, but you're highly motivated and you're interested. Because motivation is really important, I think, in these jobs. They're really hard jobs. And if you're doing it just on a lark, granted, I did it on a lark when I started, but I didn't stay that way long. I drank the Kool-Aid, shall we say, once I was in. But you need to prepare yourself and, of course, read and I say memorize the website. There's nothing worse than applying and asking a question that's answered on the website. But read. And I think the CIA probably still has a list of books about the CIA and about espionage and intelligence. Read some of those books and make sure you know them and are prepared and can discuss them when you go to your interview. Educate yourself. Certainly, if you're applying to, the DO, but some of the analytical part of the CIA or the support, learn a foreign language, travel abroad. Particularly for the Directorate of Operations, they're looking for people who have lived and spent time abroad, and ideally can speak a foreign language. The other thing I'd say is if you're still in college or you're just graduating, I'd say wait, because they rarely hire people directly out of college. They want you to have some street time, some common sense, maturity of having worked and lived out in the real world. The exception to that, I would say, by all means, if you have an opportunity to do an internship program or apply for one of their internship programs, do that. But the lead time is very long. It takes at least 9 months, I think, for them to clear you before you can get into an internship. So right now, for instance, is the time to apply for a job a year from now. And so start early. Those are great. Internships are terrific. And it's a chance for you to look at the organization that you're going into and for them to take a look at you. And there are a lot of folks who come out of those internships, a high percentage, I suspect, that get hired ultimately. So do that. And it never hurts to apply, even if you think you might not get it. It's practice. And there are a lot of folks who got turned down the first time they applied and ultimately get hired. It happens. So that I'd recommend you do. But certainly stay attuned to what's going on in the world. Read the Financial Times, read The Economist, stay current in what's going on in the world and be able to talk about it. So that's what I would say. And the other thing I would say is, and I know I sound a little Pollyanna-ish when I say this, but I really think joining the CIA was one of the best decisions of my life. And it just amazes me when I think how sort of accidental it was that I happened to open that page of the newspaper on that day and see that. And it was totally accidental. I would probably still be editing books in New York City if I hadn't seen that ad. So, I do think it's a great mission. And, it's government, so you'll have your days when you wring your hands and say, oh my God, government drives me crazy. But of all the government agencies, I'm parochial. I think it's the best or one of the best.
I agree. Well, this has been a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I want to thank Rollie Flynn and FPRI for appearing on AFIO Now today.
Thank you, Jim. It's been great to be here, and thanks. I'll put a plug. AFIO is a great organization, and I'm proud to be a member.